Okay, so we're here today to discuss the new book, Universal Politics, co-authored by Ilan Kapoor and Zahi Zalloua, published by Oxford University Press. And here it is, fresh off the presses just a few weeks ago. The book's ambitious goal is to conceptualize a universal politics to address the contemporary predations of global capitalism without resorting to the universalisms of conservative, liberal, post-colonial and Marxist thought. Instead, Ilan and Zahi look at diverse sites of contemporary struggle that are united in their common experiences of exploitation and marginalization. They argue for a negative universality rooted not in identity politics, but in common forms of social antagonism among the dispossessed and excluded, from workers' struggles and Black Lives Matter to the Palestinian question and hashtag #MeToo. So there is lots for us to talk about this afternoon. And I do encourage you to get hold of the book for your library. I'm going to post, when I've stopped speaking, the link to the website where you can get it from or suggest it to your library with a 30% off promo code, which I wish I knew last week when I ordered it. So our plan is to have each speaker take the microphone for about 10 minutes and then turn to a question and answer session so that those of you who are joining us today can share your thoughts and questions with the panelists. But let me first introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak. And I'll do all of this in one go so that we can then have them speak immediately after each other. So Ilan Kapoor is Professor of Critical Development Studies at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto. His research focuses on psychoanalytic and post-colonial theory and politics, participatory development and democracy, and ideology critique. He is the editor of the collected volume Psychoanalysis and the Global in 2018, and his authored works include The Post-Colonial Politics of Development in 2008, Celebrity Humanitarianism, the Ideology of Global Charity in 2013, and Confronting Desire, Psychoanalysis and International Development, which came out at this time last year. And one of the delights of my job as Associate Dean has been the now annual ritual of launching a new book by Ilan. So Ilan, I hope you're hard at work for next November's event.
I am.
Next will be Ilan's co-author in Universal Politics, Zahi Zalloua. Zahi is the Cushing Eales Professor of Philosophy and Literature and Professor of French and Interdisciplinary Studies at Whitman College in Washington State in the United States. He's also editor of The Comparativist. He's the author of Being Human, Ontologies of the Future, 2021, Zizek on Race Towards an Anti-Racist Future, 2020, Theories, Autoimmunity, Skepticism, Literature and Philosophy, 2018, Continental Philosophy and the Palestinian Question, Beyond the Jew and the Greek, 2017, Reading Unruly, Interpretation and Its Ethical Demands, 2014, and Montaigne and the Ethics of Skepticism, 2003. He's also published articles, edited volumes, and special journal issues on globalization, literary theory, psychoanalysis, and cultural and trauma studies. He's clearly one of the few authors who could keep up with Ilan in terms of his level of productivity, so it makes sense that they've worked together in this way. Our two panelists to comment on the book, we'll start with Sheila Cavanagh. Sheila is a professor at York University. She's coordinated the Sexuality Studies program at York and is past chair of the Canadian Sexuality Studies Association. Sheila is also the former editor of the Soma Technics Journal, and her research is in psychoanalytic sociology, gender and sexuality studies. Her first sole-authored book, Sexing the Teacher, School Sex Scandals and Queer Pedagogies in 2007, was given honorable mention by the Canadian Women's Studies Association, and her second sole-authored book, titled Queering Bathrooms, Gender, Sexuality, and the Hygienic Imagination in 2010, is a GLBT Indie Book Award finalist and recipient of the Canadian Women's Studies Association Outstanding Scholarship Prize Honorable Mention in 2012. She co-edited Skin, Culture and Psychoanalysis in 2013, has edited a special double issue of Transgender Studies Quarterly on psychoanalysis, and is now completing her third book monograph on the post-Lacanian feminist Bracha L. Ettinger. And then last up will be Anna Kornbluh. Anna is Professor of English and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's the author of The Order of Forms, Realism, Formalism, and Social Space, 2019. Also Marxist Film Theory and Fight Club, also in 2019, and Realizing Capital in 2014. She has a new manuscript currently under review called Immediacy, or The Style of Too Late Capitalism. Her essays on psychoanalysis, climate fiction, academic labor, and television have appeared in venues like Theory and Event, SAQ, Mediations, Novel, and the LA Review of Books and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's the founding facilitator for two scholarly co-laboratories, the V21 Collective, Victorian Studies for the 21st Century, and Intersect, the Inter-Chicago Circle for Experimental Critical Theory. So we're delighted to have Anna and Sheila join us as panelists to comment on the book. What we will do first, though, is to hear from the authors, and we'll start with Ilan. So over to you, Ilan.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Philip. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for attending our book launch. In fact, I wanted to begin by giving many thanks, so please indulge me for a minute, to my partner, Kent, and to my family, some of whom are here. Love you lots. And all my dear friends, you know who you are. Love you lots. I also wanted to thank Rhoda Reyes for helping organize this event, as well as our panelists. Philip for moderating. Thank you so much, Philip. And Sheila and Anna, really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the book. But mostly, let me thank my co-author, Zahi. It's been such a pleasure to write this book with you. I think it was tough work to do the writing for sure, but so very smooth and easy to write it with you. You're brilliant, or maybe I'm brilliant because I know you. But in any case, thank you very much. So before I get into the argument of our book, let me briefly give you a quick sense of what we cover in the book, our main interlocutors and our main case studies. And I'm going to share my screen here. So just bear with me. Okay. So first, our wonderful cover, courtesy of my brother Anish. Thanks again, dear Anish, for letting us use your drawing. In terms of the table of contents, the book consists mainly of 4 chapters and a conclusion. Universal Politics is the first chapter that lays out the notion of a negative universality, which I'll be summarizing shortly. And then we proceed in chapter 2 to engage in critical dialogue with several competing versions of the universal. Republican secularism, Sheila Ben Habib's Habermasian interactive universalism, Etienne Balibar's Marxist insurrectional universalism, and Edward Said's post-colonial exilic cosmopolitanism. And we do this using the Palestinian question as a testing ground for thinking through universal politics. Then in chapter 3, we take on the critics of universalism, those who advocate for a localized or a decentralized politics, including, of course, Foucault and Lyotard, their postmodern localism, Laclau and Mouffe's radical democracy, Latour and Bennett's new materialism, Lee Edelman and Sarah Ahmed's queer theory, queer universalism, Walter Mignolo's decolonial pluriversality, and Hart and Negri's Deleuzian conception of empire and multitude. And in this chapter, we focus on worker struggles as a way of examining universality. Finally, in chapter 4, we examine what a negative universality might look like today by zeroing on what we see as some of the key sites of struggle: climate change, refugee crises, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, political Islam, the Bolivian state under Morales, which as an example of what a universalist state might look like, even if it's a defective universalist state. The European Union, again, as a flawed yet promising example of what a left transnationalism could resemble. And then finally, COVID-19. And then we conclude the book by pondering the challenges and gaps of a universal politics. So let me then summarize our main theoretical argument in this book. Our basic claim is that there is a negativity at the core of all social articulations that provides the basis for a universal politics. But then how do we arrive at that claim? We begin by arguing that now more than ever, universal politics is sorely needed and lacking. This is because global capitalism appears unstoppable today. While capitalism has been highly successful in accumulating wealth, it has, as we know, left much havoc in its wake: rising inequality, geographic disparity, environmental devastation. Such havoc is accompanied by what is called the rise of post-politics. Here, social and environmental contradictions, that is inequalities, environmental crisis, are reduced to technocratic and policy problems. Governance is increasingly depoliticized so as not to threaten the smooth flow of capital accumulation and mobility. And of course, you only have to look at what's just happened at the climate talks in Glasgow to see that. COP26 as cop out, I would say. So our overall point is that now more than ever, the universalist project, that is capitalism, needs to be matched politically, not by a skepticism towards, but an embrace of a left universality. If the postmodern left tends towards getting rid of the Enlightenment idea of universality, we want to vigorously defend it. The challenge, of course, is doing so without falling into abstract universalism, which more often than not yields to a politics of exclusion and neocolonialism. The problem with abstract universalism is that it asserts an a priori category rooted in, say, nature or reason, which is then applied to all circumstances. So all men are born equal, or Europeans are civilized, or reason trumps passion. It thereby masks as neutral and objective while being enunciated from a particular position. So take today's liberal human rights discourse, for example. It famously promulgates universal rights and protections, equality before the law, private property rights, civil and political freedoms, and so forth. But the problem is that such a conception is a Western liberal one parading as universal. It secretly privileges, for example, individual rights over group or collective ones, civil and political rights and protections over social and economic ones, and by favoring private property rights in the context of patriarchy, white male property owners over workers, racialized groups, and women. Moreover, in recent decades, it has been used to justify neocolonial and military foreign policy objectives. As is well known, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq and the takeover of its oil fields was justified on the basis of bringing freedom and democracy to the country, pointing up again the extent to which abstract universalism can serve as a facade. Zizek, on whose work we rely in this book, Zizek offers instead an alternate conceptualization of universalism, a negative universality that averts these problems while enabling a universal political project. So given abstract universalism's limitation of identifying the universal with a positive content, an a priori or a particular essence, Zizek's proposal, drawing on Hegel and Lacan, is to identify universality negatively, that is, through that which is absent rather than present. Since, according to Hegel, every identity or every thought depends on that to which it stands in opposition, the other in me, contradiction is not to be seen as its limitation or weakness, but its very driving force. So antagonism what Zizek, following Lacan, calls the real, with a capital R, is therefore the internal condition of every identity. In this sense, what is universal is neither identity nor thought, but the antagonism that structures both. Since the universal is the name of the gap, the real, that prevents the particular from achieving its self-identity, it's always particularized. And so several important political implications follow from that. First, because negative universality is and can only be taken up from a particular vantage point, it is always partial, partisan, contingent. So there's a paradox here, that universality can only be articulated from a specific standpoint, making it possible to avert the postmodern trap of insisting on particularity while denying truth. In part, this is definitional, since any claim to the particular cannot be made without recourse to the universal. As Hegel famously notes, the master needs the slave as other in order to be recognized as master. That is, the very claim to masterhood is unintelligible without a shared language. And in the same vein, Etienne Balibar points out that even a racist anti-universalism, so the racist idea that whites are superior to blacks, for example, even that must invoke a universal benchmark, the notion of what it is to be human, to enable the comparison between white and black in the first place. So particularity needs an other and a shared language to distinguish itself as unique, thus always proclaiming its particularity from a universal standpoint. And that, by the way, is our main critique of all those who advocate for a localism or a pluriversality. But partly the universal truth dimension of every particular stems from the antagonism at its very heart. That is to say that truth is both contingent and universal. Every situation may well articulate a particular truth, but the emergence of that truth arises as a result of the antagonism that besets all situations. So the real here, the antagonism, is thereby a contextualized antagonism. It's not some unchanging substance, but it is immanent to every socio-historical order, reflecting any such order's inability to fully constitute itself. As Zizek declares, quote, what all epochs share is not some trans-epochal constant feature, it is rather that they are all answers to the same deadlock. Second, and I'm almost done, it is the antagonism at the hub of every particular that enables the possibility of shared struggle. So what each particular, an identity-based movement, a worker struggle, an anti-globalization protest, when each particular discovers that the deadlock which stymies it is also the deadlock that stymies others, then their common predicament becomes the basis for political solidarity. What each particular shares is not a positive content, an identity, in fact, which can end up dividing people across class, gender, racial lines, etc. What they share is an inability to complete itself as a result of a common inhumanity, but also our common patterns of socioeconomic alienation and marginalization. So hence it's this shared universality as antagonism that lays the groundwork for a global left politics. Finally, and most importantly, negative universality foregrounds the excluded, or what Jacques refugees, indigenous communities, the homeless, the racialized poor, the gendered racialized poor, etc. This is because any positive universalism, such as global capitalism, has a system, has a symptom rather, an element that must remain an exception for the very constitution of that universalism, the part of no part, the subaltern. They are symptomatic of capitalism's founding gesture, socioeconomic and spatial inequality. And although they're excluded from the system, they are its ultimate support. We designate them as the concrete universal, since it is from their particular vantage point that the truth of the system is revealed. And because they are outcasts, when they present themselves as exemplars of the universal, they do so legitimately, since unlike all other groups, they have no stake in the system. Their exceptional particularity enables them paradoxically to embrace universality, standing not for exclusive interest, but universal interest. And I'll stop there and pass it on to Zahi. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ilan. Thank you, Philip, Sheila, and Anna. And again, thank you, Ilan, for first introducing the idea of writing this book, suggesting it. A wonderful suggestion, wonderful email that I received from you about this, and it launched our book. So in my reflections today, I want us, to think about Black Lives Matter as a kind of taste of the universal politics, to expand on Ilan's ideas. So what does it mean to see Black Lives Matter as a universal project, as embodying a universal politics? Well, it means at least a couple of things. First, a rejection of identity politics. Second, a refusal to treat anti-Blackness exclusively as a struggle against domination. And I will now elaborate a bit on how these two interconnected points. So unlike other social movements, BLM refused to pursue the predictable path of identity politics. It did not seek to play the game of liberal politics, which is complain within the appropriate boundaries, and chances are you'll get recognized and be given some rights and rewards. BLM deviated from this path, and we can recall here how BLM's members refused to endorse Hillary Clinton in her failed 2016 US presidential bid. They refused to endorse someone who willfully capitalized on America's long history of anti-Blackness by championing the notorious 1994 crime bill, which characterized gangs of kids, meaning Black youth, as super predators. And here, right, one must put Joe Biden in that Clinton camp. But BLM's tumultuous relation with the Democratic Party did not end here. BLM activists also ruffled liberal feathers with their bold endorsement of the Palestinian cause and their critique of Israel as a genocidal settler state. BLM activists knew full well that as a result of aligning themselves with Palestinians, and if you're looking for political recognition in the United States, the Palestinians are the last people you want to align yourself with, right? By aligning themselves with the Palestinians, their movement would be labeled as anti-Semitic by both Democrats and Republicans. They didn't care, right? They acted on principles. So BLM signaled here a paradigmatic shift. It fostered an atmosphere of collaboration, inviting activists to couch their struggles against racial domination in global terms. What is happening in Palestine and Ferguson touches us all. Black solidarity was thus born, or rather reborn. What makes BLM's politics universal is that its call for redress is not exclusively for Black people. It is a struggle open to all, right? To use a kind of Badiou formulation here. So if BLM is an event, it must be open to all. If not, it would be kind of betrayal of that event. BLM embodies here concrete universality, as Ilan laid out. What gets disclosed in the protests is not only the suffering of Black folks, but the very logic of racial violence in American civil society. BLM's critical orientation, its universalist message, is inherent to the system, a problem for the status quo. BLM activists don't want to be recognized within the system, assuming their allocated place within the symbolic order. They're not seeking inclusion into the privileges of white society. They understand that any improvement to their lot will come at the expense of others, brown people, indigenous folks, immigrants, etc. So BLM activists aren't looking for appeasement or accommodation. Their goal is clear: to bring the unjust system down in the name of a more just state to come. So this message is increasingly making inroads with what audiences, white audiences, previously indifferent or hostile to these goals, right? As witnessed in the intensification of public outrage against police brutality in the last 2 years. So people in the United States and around the world were interpolated as witnesses to the murder of George Floyd, to this gross racial injustice. The liberal push for police reform was no longer seen as sufficient. The American script was faltering, losing credibility by the minute. It seemed that white people were waking up to the fact that the problem is not the brutality of the police, but the police itself, once the urgent call to defund the police. White liberals in particular are still struggling with this call. What does it mean for them? They're enjoying hating the haters, Trump and his supporters, the alt-right and Charlottesville protesters, and the list is long. But can they hate the police? Police officers are figures of authority that white liberals have been taught to trust, admire, and respect all their lives. The recent vote in Minneapolis is a cautionary reminder of the status quo's resilience. The bill to remove the Minneapolis Police Department from the city charter and to replace it with a public health-oriented Department of Public Safety was rejected by voters. This is a lesson in ideology. Right? Defund the police is a nice slogan for white liberal America, but don't let it actually change anything. Don't let it contribute to the dismantling of white privilege. This result and many others can give fuel to Afro-pessimism, a movement in critical Black studies that underscores the specificity of anti-Blackness, casting doubt about racial progress and the prospects of any form of cross-racial solidarity. What compels the suspicion of Afro-pessimism is the underlying anti-Blackness informing any attachment to the human. To be invested in humanity is to be anti-Black. From the vantage point of Afro-pessimism, prior critical frameworks fail to attest to the uniqueness of anti-Blackness. Frank Wilderson, a major theorist of the movement, argues that a Marxist focus on political economy, right, with a Marxist focus on political economy, there is a visible remedy to the workers' exploitation and alienation. Better working conditions, the destruction of capitalism. And with a post-colonial focus, the indigenous population can dream of a return to origins, to what he calls a time before the settler. But in the case of Black people, such relief is not available. Living under constant scrutiny, Black individuals find themselves in a state of permanent alienation. And Afro-pessimists here are keen to displace political economy with libidinal economy, underscore the extent to which anti-Blackness naturally springs from society's collective unconscious. What a libidinal economy does is regulate desires and fears, the production and circulation of anti-Blackness in white civil society. It governs our sense of who effectively matters, belongs, and counts, and who doesn't. In our book, Ilan and I have countered this Afro-pessimist temptation by reading BLM from the prism of universal politics. Blocking the all too tempting impulse to ontologize anti-Blackness, we stress how BLM's anti-racist politics is foreign to the category of separatism. This is, of course, not to deny the importance of the libidinal economy, but rather to insist on its entanglements with political economy. If Afro-pessimists champion the displacement of the latter with the former, BLM points to their ongoing entanglements. Their fight is clearly against racial domination, against the making of Blackness into a phobic object, but the movement never forgets about the anti-capitalist struggle against exploitation. White liberals don't know how to respond to this vision of BLM. Indeed, if white liberals in general are lukewarm about defunding the police, they're even more hesitant about renouncing their investment in capitalism. To be sure, if asked, white liberals will tell you that they want to reform capitalism with more rights for Blacks and other people of color. This is what Zizek denounces as a collective fantasy of a capitalism with a human face, a kind of woke capitalism. It is clear that white liberals don't see capitalism as an enterprise that was racial and racist in its origin, in its very origins. At the same time, they fail to see that white people themselves are becoming less and less immune to capitalism's voracious appetite, to what Achille Mbembe describes as the becoming Black of the world. This is why BLM is so vital for the left. BLM's racial justice message is intertwined with its call for economic justice, foregrounding the devastating role of racial capitalism. But here again, is this a message that white liberal Americans will hear? And we might consider the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. here as a kind of cautionary tale. In the US, MLK is now remembered in mainstream media as an icon of the civil rights movement, preaching tolerance and nonviolence. But what is all but erased from this portrayal is MLK's profound anti-capitalism and anti-military message. This is an MLK of toothless identity politics promoted by liberals and Democrats, liberal Democrats and conservatives alike. An MLK compatible with capitalism deprived of his revolutionary message. BLM can avoid this fate only by disrupting a futurology grounded in identity politics and the cynical calculation of self-interest. BLM can avoid its liberal co-optation by maintaining and underscoring its dual but interlocking struggles against racial domination and economic exploitation. So here the emphasis on economic exploitation is crucial, since there's also an ongoing co-optation of BLM. When Google, Amazon, Walmart, and other major companies express support for BLM, you know there's something fishy going on. Right? A deliberate attempt to contain BLM's emancipatory force and call for racial and economic justice. So not unlike green capitalism, race-conscious capitalism is precisely an ideological fantasy. So to conclude my reflections, BLM is making the impossible possible, an anti-racist critique that didn't follow the post-political path of identity politics. The fortune of BLM lies in its continued commitment to societies excluded. It lies in its ever-expanding solidarity with the part of no parts. What Black activists share with the Palestinians and other wretched of the earth is not an identity, right? We're all humans, nor even the experience of oppression. We're all victims of white supremacy, but a common struggle for emancipation. In short, BLM's message is universalist, or it is nothing at all.
Thank you very much, Zahi. And thank you both to you and Ilan for giving us such a substantive overview of the framing and the examples that the book deals with. We're going to turn next to Sheila Cavanagh to offer some reflections. Over to you, Sheila.
Okay, thank you so much. And before I begin, I would really like to congratulate Ilan and Zahi on such an impressive and significant accomplishment in the form of this book. And it's certainly a great privilege to be here virtually and to serve as a commentary. So, Universal Politics is a critique of global capitalism inspired by Lacanian psychoanalysis and the work of Slavoj Žižek in particular. Ilan Kapoor and Zahi Zalloua make a passionate argument for a negative universality which they distinguish from the particularity of identity politics. Their objective is to outline a universal politics that does not overwrite difference, but is fundamentally concerned with the shared experience of exploitation and marginalization in the global contemporary capitalist order. This would be a straight-up post-colonial and Marxist analysis if it were not for the focus upon the negative and the real. While social movements are usually founded upon an imagined community, a positive and identifiable content relating to identity, negative universality is founded upon a radical impasse in the human experience. Alienation under capitalism is, from a Lacanian perspective, real, and that is real with a capital R, because it involves a traumatic antagonistic excess. The Lacanian real is not about material reality, but about those elements and axes of experience that are unrepresentable. Much like the artwork titled Mother Rising on the book cover, a powerful work by Anish Kapoor, there is an unidentifiable black spot from which nothing can escape. Universal politics is about this real, unseeable hole in the social and human edifice. It closely follows the Žižekian interpretation of the fundamental antagonism underlying the structure of capitalism. While social movements usually focus upon particular traumas and ascribe to utopias, universal politics shares the Lacanian thesis that human subjectivity is caused by a foundational and thus universal trauma. The book admits to this inescapable fault line at the heart of the human condition, but articulates the condition under the reigning neoliberal capitalist order. While the Lacanian fault line is not specific to capitalism, there is, for Kapoor and Zalloua, a capitalist dispossession in need of a universal response. To grasp the originality of the thesis, we must remember that the Lacanian universal is unlike any other universal. One of the most important Lacanian precepts is that there is in any structure, economic, social, political, linguistic, a fault line or antagonism that cannot be sutured. A negative universality is thus predicated upon that which is irreconcilable. Universal politics is differentiated from other universals, including liberalism, feminism, post-colonialism, and Marxism. Without negating the importance of political struggles, including environmental activism, the European refugee crisis, the Palestinian struggle, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, decolonial movements, the global pandemic, and so forth, Kapoor and Zalloua consider how the ravages of capitalism get lost in the articulation of these struggles. The underlying premise is that these movements are grounded in a positive universality predicated upon identity politics, and that they fail to embrace a negative ethics. That is to say that they're based on a universalism as commonality, as opposed to a universalism as difference or as exception. Difference and exception are central to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis also offers a radical critique of identity politics and is concerned with divisions internal to the subject. Identities are, in psychoanalytic terms, defenses against difference. They are ego-based fantasies designed to conceal the way we are alienated by language. For Lacan, it is the cut of the signifier that causes an internally divided subject. The psychoanalytic objective is not to work towards synthesis and similitude, but to work creatively with the irreconcilable. Kapoor and Zalloua maintain that the only real universal is the shared antagonism under global capitalism. We might say that they, following Zizek, replaced the structure of language of concern to Lacan with the structure of capitalism. Race and gender are, for Kapoor and Zalloua, particular iterations of a universal antagonism. The problem with the particular is that it concerns a foundational economic trauma relating to capitalist exploitation, profit and class antagonism. Kapoor and Zalloua are also concerned about the extent to which the focus upon identity is co-optable by corporate interests and state agendas. When environmentalism becomes green capitalism and LGBTQ activism is pinkwashed by the Israeli government, the radical potentialities of the movements are demobilized. While Kapoor and Zalloua are right to be critical of the way identity-based movements can be assimilated into neoliberal capitalism, it is another thing to intimate, as Zizek does, that identity-based movements are not also critical of the way their activist work is co-opted. It is difficult, I would suggest, to find a social movement that does not embrace at least a minimal critique of capitalism. One may be compelled to counter that feminism, anti-racist activism, trans activism, and so forth are not post-political, as Zizek argues. I wonder if Kapoor and Zalloua may also be critical of the Zizekian thesis in this respect. Just a question. A universal politics founded upon the negative is not unlike what Jacques Haberstam refers to as a queer politics of failure. It also has much in common with the transnational feminism of Chandra Talped Mohanty and the intersectional feminism of Kimberly Crenshaw, as Kapoor and Zalloua explain, but also with grassroots transgender organizing that focuses on access to housing, employment, healthcare, and bathrooms. As I believe the authors would agree, the difference between contemporary social movements founded upon identity and the universal politics predicated upon the Lacanian antagonism is not absolute. certainly identity-based politics enjoy and suffer from more than their fair share of internal antagonisms. Nobody or movement is without the antagonism Lacan calls real. But antagonisms in and of themselves do not produce a universal politic, as Kapoor and Zalloua explain. Although they do not say it, and this is my projective speculation, it seems to me that the authors are making an argument against a politics founded upon what Lacan would call imaginary antagonisms, those impasses relating to identity that do not foreground real antagonisms, those real antagonisms of concern to capitalism. Kapoor and Zalloua's universal politic is a call to focus upon a real antagonism that transcends discourse and images, the socio-symbolic and the imaginary where identity politics cohere. Indeed, this is a bold and disruptive ground for political organizing. There is no shared consciousness, no utopian fantasy or common vision. Universal politics is founded upon an unrepresentable discord or devastation wrought by global capitalism and a desire for something else. As Kapoor and Zalloua explain, a universal politic is enabled by facing one's own antagonisms, constructing new bonds of solidarity based not on common enemies or goals, but upon loss and peril. We might say that this is a politic founded upon real trauma as distinct from an imaginary identity-based trauma. The universal struggle for emancipation is, as the authors explain, never ending. It always fails. But in this failure, we struggle again, and as they conclude, we struggle better. Such an important analysis and invitation to universal politics inspires questions and dialogue. In the spirit of a negative universal politic, I have one question about sexual difference, which the authors can, of course, decide to take up or politely ignore. I'll leave it up to them. Is universal politics sexuated in Lacanian terms? Although Lacan's sexuation formula is referred to only briefly in the book, the authors write, and I quote, that the feminine logic of the not all informs the universality of the proletarian position, putting it at odds with the masculine universalism of humanity, end quote. And I agree. But I'm curious to know more about how the universal negative operates in relation to the sexual impasse, that is the non-rapport of concern to Lacan, which grounds and enables the socio-symbolic, including but not limited to capitalism. In other words, can there be a politic founded upon the negative when there are two different ways of being in relation to that negative, which Lacan describes in relation to the phallic signifier? The masculine way, whereby there is one man who is not subordinated to the universal premise, and the feminine way, whereby each woman is not all subject to the universal premise. Another way to ask the question is if all particulars are reducible to identity politics, given that the feminine axis of difference is not for Lacan about identity, and is rather about the particularities of feminine difference, or the not all. In more general terms, I mean to ask if the Lacanian analytic of sexuation, which concerns unconscious sexuality, complicates the universal global politic founded upon the negative. And I will stop here, but once again, I just want to congratulate the authors for such an incredible achievement. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sheila. And we'll give Ilan and Zahi an opportunity to respond at the end of the panel presentations. Many thanks. We'll turn next to Anna Kornbluh. Anna, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, Can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for these wonderful remarks. I think there'll be really good conversation here. It is indeed a joyous occasion to celebrate collaborative labor of smart people that culminates in the medium of relation to others, a book, an argument, an activation of the symbolic that's interpolating readers who will encounter the words and come out the other side rotated. That this symbolic production addresses itself to contradictions in the existing social order is all the more a wonder, since we find ourselves in the omni-crisis of too late capitalism, unable to escape the contradictions of extraction, inequality, and immiseration, and we're running out of time. Yet we're in an ideological landscape in which contradiction itself is more and more repressed, disavowed, and technologically dispersed. Contemporary culture's hyper-mediatized, info-glut, algorithmic imaginary delivers binary oppositions, a loss of gray areas that is also the loss of real contradictions. In the circulation-forward digital economy, everything is flow. In the self-actualizing horizontalist anti-politics espoused by theorists and activists alike, where all conflict is branded abuse and all disagreement is branded violence, feeling seen trumps tactical negotiation, the production of consensus, and organized formations. It's all good vibes and no structure. This condition of fluid non-contradiction might be recognizable to Lacanians as an intrinsically dynamic, that is masculine, logic. Lacan's formula of sexuation, as Sheila was just discussing, based upon the Kantian antinomies of reason, inscribe two modes of thought or two modes of being, one in which universality is proven by its own exception, and another in which the inexistence of universality is belied by the lack of an exception. The masculine mode sutures opposition, all and one, while the feminine mode sustains contradiction, not all and none. For this reason, the feminine is also deemed negative. If the flat universality of integrated global capitalism accommodates the proliferation of particularities which style themselves as its exceptions, then the problem of reintroducing contradiction requires a divergent universality, one which is in non-relation with the dynamic. Thus do Ilan and Zahi call upon negative universality, or mathematic, feminine, to capacitate a left that might concertedly confront the hegemonic right. The main thrust of their delightfully astute book is that theory itself can proffer an alternative to a world mired in fantastic identities of enclosed individualism or nihilist exceptionalism, and eruptive reals like fascism and violence. Theory itself can remediate the sorry affairs of post-politics. But a specific theory, the negative universality animating the oeuvre of Slavoj Žižek. Against Žižek, there stand reams of misguided political theories which obfuscate contradiction that Ilan and Zahi deftly parry. And then they turn to look carefully at activist movements for glimmers of contradiction shining through. The book renders a really true service in strenuously, generously critiquing colleagues of ostensibly left thought and left action, whose ideas and practice fall short. In the book's analysis, contemporary movements come closer to the promise of negative universality than contemporary theory does. So the framework implies that incorrect theories can find prompts for better formulations in the actually existing practice of contemporary activist struggles like Black Lives Matter. But the book itself, with its thoughtful and synthetic arguments, makes a counter implication that the right theory should drive political praxis. And that seems also intended by the overarching commitment to Žižek that guides the whole book, his affecting of a negative universality, which the book perhaps stitches into a more systematic program than his own corpus does, is really faithfully esteemed here. So the book works itself out, I think, as a defense of theory in a way that seems quite a departure from the anti-theoretical tendencies of so much current writing, which is increasingly invested, maybe your colleagues too, in setting aside even the idioms of taking exception to universalism in a generic way, and taking up instead titillating self-revelation, an auto-theory primed for popular audiences, literate largely in an individualist idiom. And why shouldn't they be writing these when the destruction of the university means that there's little venue for transmission of knowledge otherwise? So the kind of striking investment in theory of this book, the commitment to symbolic production, I think opens up some points of reflection, given its divergence from the theory landscape and the kind of truisms of practice. The first issue is symbolic efficacy. More than the old saw of theory versus practice, or even the older saw of idealism versus materialism, today this question of using the symbolic aptly, of making space for contradiction, of describing political dynamics in such a way that they resonate, of upholding a negative universality as a winning activist strategy. This question has to confront the material conditions, including the libidinal conditions, of the decline of symbolic efficacy. A cadre of psychoanalytic theorists, Zizek himself, but also Jody Dean, Todd McGowan, Byung-Chul Han, Jacob Johansson, and others, have been making the case for most of the 21st century that infoglut, the democratic enthusiasm for expressive communication, the populism of anti-expertise, and a critical deconstruction of objectivity, universality, and truth are all precipitating a transformation in the functioning of language. A regime of alternative facts, relativity, and speak your truth transparency emerges from the raising of institutions for coordinating signification, education first among them. It emerges from corporate consolidation of media and communications, from the dismantling of the journalism industry, and from the proliferation of image technology. This ongoing degradation of the symbolic results in an intensified imprisonment in the imaginary, along with corollary ruptures of unmediated reals. How does the book's defensive theory acknowledge the attacks on education and the media ecology of the imaginary? A question is really genuinely, can better theories intervene in this situation? Can subjects traverse the relations of the master signifier and take up a negative logic when they've not even been integrated into the symbolic in the first place? What is the psychoanalytic negative universal strategy for making a cut in the imaginary? The second issue follows from this. The epistemic and libidinal orientation of the negative universal is perhaps formulated in two different ways in this book. One's tempted to say, not all negativity. It's not all the same as itself. Negativity is not self-identical, right? At times in the book, we get negativity as the sustaining of contradiction, as in the incantation, Black Lives Matter, which marks the contradictory formulation, that of course they should matter, right? At other times, it's a suspension, what they call a desubstantialization, open-endedness, undecidability, Rancierian disruption, and emptying out of particular content. That's a quote also. So what if this latter version, a subtracting from the register of contradiction, shades too easily into denuded negations that are overwhelming in conventional theory? Sublimity, evanescence, messianism, nihilism, and that are most vexingly kind of indices of theory's own immersion in an anarcho-vitalist imaginary that countenances no symbolic cuts. As you guys yourselves remind us in one of the book's best punctuations, quote, all that is bereft of meaning is not necessarily left-leaning. So perhaps there's a crucial distinction the book glances at without all the way underscoring, a distinction between idealist negativity that admits of no mediation, abyssal agon, and a contrasting materialist negativity in which the incompletion of the social is not a metaphysical void, it's not a spiritual predicament, right? But a practical incitement to make mediation, to construct symbolization, to give form. Then we would need more incantations, more inscriptions, more symbolizations, ways for negative universalism to effectuate construction, taking the risk to mediate, to put into medium, to formalize contradiction. Does the formula, "there is lack," attain negative expression? Everybody hurts, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. Surely the injunction, "blow up a pipeline," does. If we refrain from symbolization of negative universals, we cede the mediations that bring us out of identities of the imaginary, to which fluid masculine universality belongs, and we fail to forge solidarity. That's another punning blade. That's one of the book's gems. We have to take the risk to make a construction, the new signifier at the ends of analysis. Holding off too long from synthesis and romanticizing indeterminacy precludes the emancipatory fact that the simplest ideas are often the most effective, and that little shards of language can compose collectives. Minimal substantializations of the negative are crucial for activating the symbolic as the medium in which solidarity obtains. And they're not betrayals of negative universality's negativity. Minimal, like no more billionaires, no pipelines, no justice, no peace. We don't have time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. We will turn to questions from our participants, but maybe we'll ask Ilan and Zahi if they would like to respond to some of Sheila and Anna's points before that. I see you have unmuted in anticipation. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anna and Sheila, for all the time that you put in to read this book so carefully, and for so many provocations. I'm not sure we can take them all on, but I'll certainly try. Or maybe I should say, I refuse to answer these questions because Zahi knows all the answers. But I'll take up a couple, and then maybe should I start, Zahi, and then you can please pick up on maybe on some other ones. First, Sheila's point about us maybe going a bit too strong on identity politics. I mean, this is also a criticism of Zizek, yeah, that he over subscribes to the critique of identity-based movements. And, you know, I mean, I think we're pretty well on side with him for the most part, from what I can tell. It's not to demean the struggles of identity-based movements, of course. They and we should demand our rights, but we have to keep in mind that these are only the rights permitted under the system. So politically, identity politics is a dead end, because it is what is permitted and tolerated by the system, by liberal democratic capitalism. It doesn't threaten capital mobility and accumulation. And in fact, as we bring up in the book quite a bit, it helps maintain it, put a human face on it, as Zahi pointed out in the case of certain versions of Black politics in the US. And indeed, it reproduces it through allowing for the commodification of culture and identity. Now, of course, identity may be articulated with anti-capitalism, but then it seems to me that it's not the identity part that matters. That's what divides, and it's a positivity. And because it's a positivity, it can easily be co-opted and depoliticized, commodified. Instead, it's the anti-capitalist articulation that matters, yeah? That aims at dismantling the common patterns of alienation. So, I mean, to your point, are all particulars reducible to identity politics? No, that is part of our argument, or the particular may articulate in terms of identity, but the challenge is coming to terms with the negativity of the particular, precisely, with our own inhumanity, with our own alienation. Yeah. So anyway, it would be in that direction that I would go, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Sheila, but certainly that's how I would try and answer it. On Anna's question about theory, I think that's a great point. I mean, yes, what we need alongside this book is another book on on the psychoanalysis of negativity, I suppose. And I mean, and both of us, Zahi on his end and I on my end, have written on that. So clearly, an accompanying book that deals with negativity through the libidinal, because the argument is, as we know, is that theory fails, that knowledge is not enough. And in fact, knowledge can be part of the problem because of the fetishistic disavowal, right? I know, and yet I continue to carry on as if I didn't know. And so the only way to get at the problem is through facing the libidinal. So you're right. I certainly accept. But so maybe in a year from now, Zahi and I will write that accompanying book.
Well, thank you, Sheila and Anna, for wonderful, fantastic comments. So I think one of the problems with Zizek is often the reception of identity politics that angers him, rather than, let's say, looking at Jack Halberstam's actual engagement with identity politics, which is far more complicated. I mean, his more recent book on the trans community, trans generations, his reflection on, adding the asterisk to trans as an attempt to queer the identity of trans subjects, and his reflections on, trans rights, let's say in prisons, how, the liberal machinery would say, let's give trans more rights so they can fit, they're not targeted, so they're treated like any other inmates. And Halberstam's point, no, we should use the occasion of trans bodies to rethink the very idea of caging people. So there is this opening to the universality in Halberstam. And I think there is a rapprochement to be made here between Zizek and what Halberstam is doing and what Moten and Harvey are doing in the under comments. I think there's a lot of overlap that Zizek ignores, because identity politics is, from the very beginning, dubious, rather than looking at, most of the time, occasionally he makes a distinction, we need short-term interventions, but we can't forget about the long-term struggle against capitalism. And often identity politics is committed to reforming capitalism. So, we can make it better. Capitalism is here to stay. There's no real alternative. So let's just maximize what we can get out of the system. So that would be one way in which one can bring Zizek closer to identity politics while still insisting on the kind of irreducibility of the two. And I think connected to Anna's reflection here, that the quote about what is bereft of meaning is not necessarily subversive was a kind of translation of Badiou, tout ce qui bouge n'est pas rouge. So there's a kind of euphoria about instability that can be fetishized. And that comes often with, the subversion of the system. And we ended the conclusion is, what comes after the system? I mean, this is where the kind of the euphoria weakens. And how do you move? How do you sustain that logic of not all? How do you sustain the patu that Lacan and Zizek deploys? It's difficult. almost impossible. I mean, and this points to the failure of politics. I mean, to give something concrete, right? Concrete in terms of imagining, let's say, an intervention in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So if binationalism emerges as a kind of response to this antagonism, right? Antagonism that a settler colonial critique highlights, one can reimagine Palestinians being acknowledged as equal. So they're no longer the part of no parts. In a sense, they enjoy the full rights of the polity. In that society, one can imagine, if anti-Blackness is not kept in check, that the symptom of binationalism would be the Ethiopian Jew. And any emancipatory Palestinian would have to identify with the Ethiopian Jew as a critique of this new formed Palestinian state, which in many ways, checks all the aspirations of many Palestinians. So here, this would be, in a sense, to remain faithful to this antagonism. Who gets excluded? Who's going to be the new wretched of the earth? Nobody can monopolize that position. And I think universal politics will always be attentive to, whatever you're going to impose, whatever gets replaced, will also generate its other. And that's one version of the logic of not all that I think we're both committed to.
Great, thank you, Zahi, and thank you, Ilan. We have about 20 minutes left, and so we do have an opportunity to hear from folks who have been listening. Nobody, I think, or hardly anyone will have seen the book. I haven't made it out of the introduction yet. Mine arrived 2 days ago. So don't feel inhibited from asking question or clarification if you haven't seen the book. I will keep a speaker list. If you could raise your hand in Zoom using the reaction button at the bottom, I will keep a speaker list, and we'll go through in turn, and hopefully keep the questions and the responses relatively brief so that we can get through a number of them. Miguel, hi, good afternoon. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much, Philip, and congratulations for such an amazing and provocative publication to Ilan and Zahi. My question is just a comment, and maybe I think it's a question as well. I would say many of the identity-based struggles, BLM, indigenous and environmental movements, are also about defending, protecting, preserving both human and non-human life that is being threatened by extractive necropolitics of advanced capitalism. Does your book speak to this question, to the question of life, as a dimension of many social movements under globalized neoliberalism? And how does a universal negativity would approach the question of preserving life as a shared universality or a shared humanity? I'm just curious about your thoughts on this question. Thank you very much.
So maybe I can try to begin to answer your question. Ilan can step in. So one of our engagement was with Afro-pessimism, and the virtues of that movement is to call for a reckoning, political reckoning with the very idea of the human, which is predicated on anti-Blackness. And since one cannot celebrate the human unless you see the Black body as a slave, as pure abjection. So a universal politics cannot repeat the human, right? The everyday understanding of the human, the Enlightenment vision of the human. The human as such, its connection to life would have to be completely reconfigured. So the animal, the human as a non-human animal, the animality of the human, all of this would have to be brought back into conceptualization. In our discussion of decoloniality, Miniolo's vision And the belief that the problem, I mean, how he identifies the problem of capitalism as a kind of economic coloniality, and the push to de-link with the Western world, right, with coloniality, becomes his remedy to enjoy the sovereignty of the land, a non-Western approach to humans, non-humans, animals, the lands, has limitations, because it believes in a kind of original harmony, right? This is what Wilson complains about the time before the settler. So there's no time before this. The time before the settler is a fantasy that you can somehow recapture. And even the time before the settler was never harmonious. There are always antagonisms, always conflicts, always divisions from within. So, so here, on the first question of the human, Afro-pessimism, I think, invites us to rethink what the human stands for. And a critique of capitalism invites us to be deeply skeptical of any harmonious state that involves human and non-humans. That would be my my response to your thought.
Right, just briefly, I'll add just a little bit to that. And one of the things that we do in the book is draw on the idea of the real neighbor with a capital R, for thinking not just the political, but solidarity. So in contradistinction to the common injunction to love thy neighbor, the idea here is to view the neighbor as inert, as impenetrable. Yeah. So the other is not unquestionably good to be cherished without reservation, but as Zahi just said, the embodiment of a traumatic thing, which is the bearer of an impenetrable kind of animality, right? So the fundamental antagonism lies not so much between me and you, but within me, in my own animality, in my own inhumanity. And I think that makes for an ethics or to the other, whether the other is human or so-called animal. Yeah. So implicit is a rejection of the notion that one can and should know or understand one's neighbor, rather, which kind of reduces them to sameness as a mirror image of oneself, and then ends up essentializing the other, controlling them under the pretense of charity and beneficence and care. So, you know, the idea is to reconceptualize the idea of the neighbor here as an agonistic ethic. So we should extend an obligation to the other precisely because they are not like us.
Yeah.
And so that would be the extension to the non-human other.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful question.
We had a question from Stefan, although you disappeared off my screen. Stefan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I withdrew one of my questions because of the previous response, but nonetheless, I was curious listening to your comments. By the way, thanks so much for producing this book. I'm obviously very sympathetic to the project, not having read it yet, but I will do so. I was just curious, this is somewhat of a minor question, what your empirical basis is to bring in the cases throughout the book. I mean, you expanded on the Black Lives Matter movement, and you made certain claims about it, which I can sort of follow at one level, but not at another level. And so I was wondering what the, I guess, textual basis for your engagement with the various cases is that you're discussing in the book.
Right. My response would be, I mean, it is the kind of the challenge of how do we translate this, you know, dense theoretical kind of argument into real life. And I think that is the challenge. We should not shy away from the challenge of looking at case studies in our current global order, right? But I mean, we preface all our case studies by saying there are no easy answers or formulas for addressing any of these cases. And this is why in all the cases that we have looked at, we have not hesitated to underline their weaknesses, their failings, their challenges, their internal divisions, right, to live up to the idea of antagonism, their internal debate. So we readily admit that all of them are defective exemplars of universality, but they point to the condition of possibility always. And we would argue that that while a universal politics aims at facing down and working through our deadlocks, which always confront us, we can never get beyond them. So as I think somewhere in the conclusion, we say there's no triumph after victory, only more work, only more struggle, only more failure. So success is only a temporary thing. I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at, but that's our philosophical approach to all our case studies. Zahi, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I mean, so we also took our cue from Zizek when he occasionally formulates it, who's a candidate for the part of no parts. Since there's no longer a revolutionary class, since the worker is not going to be the universal subject that will revolt, he introduces the notion of the kind of proletarian position. So we have to look at sites that could open up and exert sufficient pressure on the system. And this has to be coordinated. It has to be a kind of collaboration of multiple sites. So our book is by no means exhaustive of these sites, but we want to give enough flavor, enough sense of what it would look like from different areas. And then one can look for different parts of no parts emerging, and how can their resistance translate as a kind of universal process, universal goal. So in terms of indigenous movements, one can have an indigenous movement where you're fighting for claims to land, for greater sovereignty. If this gesture does not link up with other movements that will equally put pressure on settler colonialism relationship to global capitalism, then the movement will not have a status of the part of no parts. It will not be engaged in undermining global capitalism. It may succeed partially in getting more rights, more sovereignty. But I think any such movement is not going to be satisfied with partial recognition, right? A politics of refusal precisely has to be a universal project, has to contribute to that, to mass movements. And interestingly, Brent, you've had a lot of indigenous movements, Idle No More, solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and Free Palestine. So these movements are working together and are expanding. And our hope here, right, emerges out of what Zizek calls, following Agamben, the courage of hopelessness. You have to see the present system as hopeless in order to imagine something radically different, right? If you still believe things can be reformed, then universal politics is definitely not for you.
I guess what I also heard in Stefan's question was something simpler, but perhaps also quite fundamental, which is in a sense, the empirical basis for discussing these movements, the textual sources, the ways in which you have engaged with them to be able to speak of them. Could you comment on that, perhaps?
Right, and if I may add, Philip, yeah, thank you. Obviously, this is partly an empirical question, but it also speaks to another condition of universality, which is the intelligibility. Sorry, the way in which our claims about the world are intelligible to others, right?
Yeah.
So, in other words, if you want to convince me about Black Lives Matter this and worker struggles that, we need to have we need to operate on a presupposition, which itself is to some extent universal, about us being able to come to an agreement, or at least a shared understanding of what we are talking about through our language.
But this is a struggle of meaning. I mean, I think if you ask, card-carrying liberals, they'll say Black Lives Matter is a movement I fully support, right? I have a Black Lives Matter statement on my window, like I support this. But it becomes a kind of ideological support, right? It's a support, it's a desire for change with no actual change. So we're intervening in the reception of Black Lives Matter, looking at their platform, where they're actually arguing. What is pro-Black Lives Matter movement reception stressing? Are they transforming that movement into a kind of toothless movement? Or can you tap into their actual rage, right? So I think it becomes an interpretive fight, right? A struggle for meaning. And, when there's something deeply disturbing when, Google and all these major companies support Black Lives Matter, but treat their workers like shit. I mean, there is a disconnect, right? And one has to point out that contradiction.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Ravindra. Please go ahead, Ravindra. You'll need to unmute though.
You need to unmute Ravi at the bottom of your screen. There you go.
Well, you see, I'm interested in the argument about case studies and universality. And I have two related questions. One is that if there is a Dalit community, untouchable community in India, which does not, which has a taboo about seeing, about not being seen and not being seen by the high caste people, then the question of representing this taboo is portrayed in a cinematic form by a pubescent girl of the community. Now, she is the one who is eventually raped. Now, the point is that she has a taboo, inbuilt taboo of not being seen. Now, I think if the cinematic representation is from a female point of view, a pubescent female, then I think the question of representing the community as a whole, the group as a whole, becomes relevant from the marginalized position to the central position. Now, I think this cuts across a feminist reading from a reading of seeing and unseeing, you see. And this is an example where I think a cinematic representation of the case study and the universality of experiences can be coordinated. And I wonder if our talented authors here would say something on transgender representation and pubescent girls representation from the margins from the point of view of the society as a whole, that they are not to be seen, and the people and the girl herself thinks that she should not be seen. And then there is rape. So, I mean, I think, isn't there a certain veracity in representations through humanities media like the film, which captures the dilemma and the predicament of the society and the community? in a universalistic frame. Sorry, I have not articulated myself very well, but I think this is what I feel, if there can be a comment on this.
Zahi, do you want to go?
I mean, I can say something very briefly and then turn to you, Ilan. If I understood your general sense of comments here, so the importance of representation, right? Those who've been structurally excluded fits nicely within a kind of a humanist framework, right? Where it's a question of a politics of recognition, right? Making visible those who've been denigrated. And I think there is some immediate rewards with this, right? I think, you know, people who've been systematically ignored gets visual representation. But there's a certain limit out of the model, out of the humanist model, right? I mean, this refers back to Ilan's evocation of the real neighbor. That, in a sense, one has to be able to challenge the matrix of intelligibility, right? Rather than try only to work within it. One can understand the gesture. In a sense, you want to make somebody appear legitimate, appear as if they belong to society. But that system will not really be altered. That system will still generate somebody else who will occupy the position of the transgendered subject. One can understand this as a short-term intervention, but one must see the limitations of that gesture. I mean, historically, we have centuries of that model, and it hasn't really yielded a vision that is truly emancipatory.
Yeah, Ravi, it's a wonderful question. Thank you very much, Ravi. But what I didn't understand was why you think the cinematic would be a meaningful way of getting at the raped Dalit child, for example, as opposed to other forms of representation. The cinematic, after all, is not an unproblematic medium, right? Because everything depends on what the frame is, who's left out of the frame, and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering why. Yeah.
If I may add,
yeah.
I mean, I think that the sense of seeing is both in the cinema and in the characters here. And this is not an imaginary situation completely. That's the empirical part of it. I mean, there is a community in Tamil Nadu where this happens. And I think cinematic representation probably more than words and description in a text would be more powerful to convey symbolically. I mean, Professor Cavanagh focused on symbolization, and symbolization is the heart of the matter that I am thinking about here. And therefore, I think, Ilan, I mean, I feel that cinematic representation will be powerful. It will be a supplementary to your thing about negative universality. But this is something which I want to convey in relation to the interface between the social sciences and the humanities.
Right. Oh, I couldn't agree more, for sure, for sure. But again, I would preface that by saying, well, but the cinematic itself, you know, is not unproblematic. That's you know, that the gaps, the antagonisms that we talk about apply to any text and to any to the symbolic order generally.
Can I suggest that we have one last question? We're slightly over time, so but I would like to get one last question in from Radhika, and then we'll come back to the panel for a quick final word from each of the four of you. Radhika, please go ahead.
And yes, so we'd love to hear from Anna and Sheila as well, please, to any of the responses to any of the questions. Thank you.
Thanks again, Ilan and Zahi, for what sounds like a fabulous book, and also to Sheila and Anna for their engagements with it, which have helped flesh out in more detail what's the contents of the book. So my question is back to this matter of case studies and the empirical. I guess it is, do movements like BLM serve as illustrations for your argument? Or do they serve as the provocations or the occasion for the argument? And I think that's, I'm very curious to know whether it's BLM or the various other social movements you're addressing. So are those to illustrate your argument, and that sort of the empirical's purpose is merely to validate the theory? Or is it that the empirical is provoking the argument? And I want to link that up to, where you started, Ilan, by saying that we must match the universality of capitalism with a kind of political universality in countering it. And that's why you're offering this negative universality, right? But given that the so-called universality of capitalism is a historical formation, it has not always been universal. So are these kinds of movements something new? So I want to just understand how you are grasping capitalism, how, historically grounded is that? How historically are you thinking about these movements? And therefore, the question itself, which is, are the various cases sort of being used inductively, or are they being used as illustration, or sort of what's the, Thank you.
I think it's both. I think it's both in the sense that, we're trying to illustrate the argument, but we're also trying to show through the particular, once again, how the antagonism manifests. And that's why our choice of case studies is that we haven't only looked at movements, we've also looked, for example, at the question of the state. So, and Bolivia under Morales as an example of a flawed yet important model for thinking through a universalism at the level of the state. And then the European Union as a model for thinking of transnationalism, even if it's flawed. I guess we're trying to do a lot with our case studies. And they're north and south. We're trying to do a lot, and which is to say that yes, the question of history that you pose is a very important one. I'm not sure we do justice to certainly the history of capitalism or the history of these movements per se. But it is a theoretical intervention in that sense, without, as flawed as that will be, as Anna pointed out.
It's a wonderful answer, Ilan. I mean, we hope it does both, as Ilan says, illustrates and enacts a universal politics through these movements. And I think the future of these movements and their realization of a kind of universal politics will depend on how inventive they remain. How can they resist the urges to place them in pre-existing slots, which is always the danger of any kind of movement that can be neutralized. So their inventiveness will be symptomatic of their success or failure. And failure they will, and what new emergence would come out of their failure. What do we learn from these movements?
And if I could just add one other thing, and that is that the other important angle that was at the forefront of our mind when we looked at the case studies was bringing out, as Zahi said earlier, the part of no part, so that climate change, the advantage of the climate crisis is that negative universality is already built into it. It brings home the idea of humans as a species. but without addressing as well the role of the part of no part, then climate change, it is meaningless. It becomes nothing but another form of sustainable development. So bringing out how climate change affects the excluded, I think, is what makes the climate change movement universal. So that's another dimension.
In solidarity with those who are alphabetically marginalized, like Zahi, we're going to have our last question from Anna Zalek. Go ahead, Anna.
Hi, huge congratulations to Ilan and Zahi. Nice to meet you. Thank you to all of the panelists for such an interesting discussion. Although I'm about to mention that I may have missed something that was discussed because I was also having some internet problems. So I'm asking a question that perhaps has already been raised, at some point in the panel. But in any case, just, not specifically on the argument as presented, but more interested in your reflections on the notion of universality and sort of the endorsement of violence. So not and physical violence. So not violence not violence on the part of capital here. I mean, that's obviously, the kind of backdrop, but just wondering, thinking about, Fanon and other kinds of, I was also thinking about Malm's, how to blow up a pipeline, I'll admit. And this is kind of partially informing this question about the ways in which a universal politics might call for actions that are seen, on the part of the excluded that use armed means, right? So I'm sorry. So I'm just interested in your thoughts about that, and what the limits would be, obviously, to such a politics. And I think just sometimes there's this, not that I'm endorsing armed social mobilization. I just think about sort of the conjuncture we're at and the seeming inability of movements to confront capital. And I'm just interested in your reflections on that, on the relationship between that and a universal politics.
Yeah. Actually, it's something we didn't reflect on in the book for sure. So it's not something that we've discussed between us, Zahi and I. So, I think it's a difficult question, the question of violence and political action, because even though I actually did my master's thesis on Gandhi, I'm loath to actually go all the way with Gandhi on that. That nonviolence is the only means. I think we need to do as much of that as we can, but I don't think it can be an absolute rule. And in fact, Gandhi himself recognizes that there's no such thing as pure nonviolence. But in any case, I mean, in terms of the global capitalist order, we mustn't forget that what we take as normal in our global capitalist order is built on violence. Yeah? Our daily lives subsume violence especially to the environment, but also to the subaltern and so on and so forth. Which I think legitimizes, at least to some extent, the violence that some movements feel they must use in order to wake us up, in order to get their voices heard, and so on and so forth, and which is kind of Fanon's view, right? That the cleansing dimension of violence, we cannot forget that. So it's an ambiguous answer, but I would say that I certainly cannot be opposed to the use of violence in some cases.
I would add maybe 2 points to this. Zizek infamously said that Gandhi was more violent than Hitler, right? Because violence here has to be measured about the effects on the system. So armed struggle could be violence, but it could be also an act of impotence, not real act that is not motivated by a political project. And often, the second point would be that nonviolence gets fetishized frequently, right, as the only way for transformation. And this position usually ignores that it's hard for some people, it is hard to opt for nonviolence when somebody's boots is on your neck, right? So nonviolence often becomes a kind of white privilege, right? You know, as if everybody had the choice of not engaging in armed struggle and being physically violent. But I think the first point is always the more important point, to focus on what actually disturbs the system. Whatever disturbs the system is going to be violence, is going to be experienced as violent by the symbolic order. So if it's through peaceful means or armed struggle, what are its effects? That's the focus, I think, in my eyes. And it depends how you organize, how do you mobilize resistance versus, you know, violent or non-violent distinction.
Okay, thank you. We are going to have to wrap up fairly quickly. I know that Zahi has to teach in a quarter of an hour and others may be in the same situation. I'm going to invite Anna and Sheila to offer any very brief comments to conclude with, and then come back to Ilan and Zahi to finish. Sheila, would you like to come back?
Sure. I just want to again congratulate Zahi and Ilan for an incredible achievement. And the other thing that I would just like to say quickly is it can be really difficult to take what I would consider to be important psychoanalytic ideas and translate them into a political context. And so the idea of negative universality, I think, is extraordinarily important. It's very difficult to translate, and I would argue shouldn't be translated into a particular recipe for how to do politics better. I certainly read the universal politics as an invitation to think about the negative, to think about the antagonisms that structure everyday life, and to introduce a pause or a moment of reflection, or just to acknowledge that sometimes things don't quite work out in the way that we think they might. And so what can we do creatively with the impasse? You know, how could we think in Lacanian terms symptomatically about what does not work out so that we can imagine life and the political otherwise?
Okay, thanks, Sheila. And Anna, would you like to come back?
I would. I mean, I just think that this question that Miguel posed actually really usefully underscores the distinction I was trying to make about, you know, maybe imaginary negativity and kind of a more symbolic negativity. And that if we were with the activists that Miguel is speaking about, right, say pipeline activists or refugee activists, right, people who are confronting in their corporeal situation the fact that human life is, you know, undergoing a forced extinction, and only some of us are responsible for that, right? But we are an animal that has caused this extinction and is being the unevenly, you know, sort of allocated, bearing the victimization of it unevenly. And if our answer to those people is, oh, but the human, we have to dispel this, it's an Enlightenment fantasy, it's a nonsense, I don't think that's a good strategy at all. Like, I think you have to risk minimal representation, minimal symbolization of what is at stake. And so I think that the negative universal has to have its point of formalization. Like, there's not no construction, there's not no signification. So if this is a kind of project of translating an epistemic framework or a theoretical framework into activist tactics, I think the tactic has to be to risk representation.
Thank you, Anna. So back to Ilan and Zahi for a final word.
Oh, I just want to, my final words are just to thank you all around so much to Anna and Sheila for your wonderful comments, to all the great questions and comments. To Philip, thank you so much for being such an amazing moderator as well. and especially to Zahi for being my co-conspirator in this project. Thank you.
This is the kind of event you want to be kind of perpetually sustained. So thank you so much, all of you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to all of our panelists, and congratulations especially to Ilan and Zahi on this achievement. I've just noted in the chat that if anyone would like to receive the video of today's discussion, please just email me. I don't think we get your videos from the Zoom recording. So just drop me a line. I'd be happy to send that, and we'll send it out on the list within the faculty here. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon and weekend, and stay healthy.
Thanks.
Thank you.